Hi, everybody. I'll start, right? And then you'll go after. I'm David Rivas. I'm one of the four organizers. Oh, hmm. There we go. Welcome to the social at AKBC. Um, See, this is how I try to modernize the social by putting the @ sign, right? I'm gonna set the tone a little bit just now as we get into this topic. We'll sort of, I think we'll go, I think we'll do like a round of introductions just to familiarize ourselves. Just a few minutes, but let me just like set the tone a little bit first of what we're discussing. Um, I'll do that in part by introducing myself, but also in part by telling you some sort of narrative stories, which is often what we do in the kind of social science that I do. I'm a social scientist, by the way. Um, Let me just give you quickly a sense of the agenda, though, so you have an overview. Then we'll get into the details later. I saw that you have some slides too, Chaitan, so you can get into the details. So we're doing, for the first hour and a half, we're sort of scene setting on this question of what is social for knowledge bases, what is social, period, in some sense. So you're gonna hear from me, you're gonna hear from Chaitan, you're gonna hear from Elena, and then you're also going to hear maybe, how do we put it? Our fourth member who was going to speak, Jeff Bowker, isn't going to make it, but he's sort of he's got a guru-like quality now that he's emeritus and so on, and he sent us some very cryptic notes that I think we can collectively interpret. I think that would be a fun exercise. He doesn't have to, he's retired, he's emeritus, he's a senior, he's very famous, he doesn't have to be clear. And so instead he can be more,
Report that to Jeff.
Yeah. All right, so that'll be the first hour and a half, and there's gonna be lots of room for discussion, so we'll sort of like set the stage of like, what is it that we're looking at, what does the social mean in this context, and have some discussions around that as well. Then we'll take the break, have our coffee. Thank you all for showing up so early too. Then we'll wake up, right, finally at 10. And then the next hour we had submitted papers, and so we'll have small presentations, 10-minute presentations or so on the submitted papers, each one of them exploring a different facet of the question of the social, relative to knowledge bases or knowledge representation, or the question of the social inside of the sciences more generally. And then have another discussion. There should be lots of room for discussion as well. And then we'll conclude with a kind of like a next steps discussion. Where do we take this next? So why are we interested in the question of the social at AKBC? Obviously, it's a technical conference with technically specialized people, usually asking very technical questions. Often we sort of cast the social as the opposite of the technical. We often sort of like put a slash, right? Technical / social. And so why are we even discussing this here? Well, so one, this is the beginning of a conversation. We're interested in opening up something here. It isn't gonna, I don't wanna absolutely define the agenda of exactly what's gonna happen at this conversation and going forward. Think of it as the beginning of a conversation, and you're going to hear many angles from different people, I think, on the question of what does it even mean to say social in this context. I'm really going to try to open that up also in this presentation. But also, this is the beginning of conversation, but sort of it's also saying we need to join a larger conversation that is occurring across the fields that are concerned with questions of artificial intelligence, machine learning, data, knowledge representation more widely. I'm just giving you one example if you want to look it up online. There's the sort of the premier conference right now that is considering what we may call social issues in matters of computing, AI, ML, and so on, is FACT. This is the ACM conference on fairness, accountability, and transparency. It used to be called FATSTAR. So if you look it up, that is what it was before. They kind of decided that they didn't particularly like that name anymore. And so they changed it over to FACT instead, but it's still ongoing. You can see it's a long conversation that's been occurring in that field around the question of how do we include humans, human questions, questions of politics, questions of representation, questions of privacy and security. All of those have been long explored in this community. And so in this sense, it's less about us coming up out of nowhere and saying questions of the social are relevant to what's going on within this community as well. It's saying this community sort of needs to participate in a conversation that is expanding across what we often define as technical fields. And it's actually a far, far older conversation as well. Here we are in 2022, but let me just show you, this is one of my favorite very old papers. This is from 1989. It's written by a collaboration of anthropologists, so someone sort of from my field, Diane Forsyth, and then Bruce Buchanan, who formally is trained as a computer scientist. You might recognize his name. He was one of the co-developers of the system called Mycin, which is one of the very earliest, it was like a rule-based expert system, developed initially in the 1970s, and then sort of over time, and then there was like a shell that was built on top of it called eMycin that you might have heard of. Well, Buchanan was one of the key figures, and he very, very early, starting in the late 1970s and then going through the entire 1990s, had an ongoing collaboration with this woman, Diane Forsyth, who was by training an anthropologist. Kind of in the same field as I am as well. I'm also a version of anthropology as well. They collaborated together around questions of knowledge acquisition. This is when, of course, knowledge was sort of handcrafted, right? The knowledge representation was done by hand rather than any kind of like automated fashion. We can talk about that distinction, by hand, automation. I think it probably should be a topic of discussion for this room. But at the time, anyways, they were crafting these knowledge representations in the sense of going to experts, eliciting knowledge from them, and then encoding it into the predicate logic and into a machine, and so on. And so there were already people working on the question of like, what is it to elicit knowledge from different kinds of experts? What are the challenges of eliciting knowledge? What gets covered and what doesn't get covered? What can be expressed and what cannot be expressed? What difficulties does an expert have saying what their knowledge is, or how knowledge is contested in a field? All of these were being explored already in the 1980s by these collaborations of computer scientists and social scientists. And so I'm giving you a little sense, like this is an old conversation, but I want to give you like a little sense too that something happens, that it's continuously a forgotten conversation. It drops off again and again. I myself have been doing this for about 20 years, since the early 2000s, and it's funny that you always have to begin the conversation of the social again, especially within technical circles. And it's always like a bit of a surprise to people who are very, very technically focused on, say, encoding knowledge or representing it or working with it in computational forms. There's always like a bit of a, you have to learn it again, and then again, and then again. I've had to sort of like start this over again every few years, and I think it goes on far before me. And so you might want to just ask, that's sort of like I'm posing the question, why does it drop off? Why does the question of the social sort of drop off again and again and have to be reintroduced? What is the dynamic that is occurring there? And I have some theories about that, but I sort of want to leave it more as an open question for the group. Okay. So let me introduce myself, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of an example. So David Rebus. I'm at University of Washington in Seattle, where I'm an associate professor in a department called Human-Centered Design and Engineering. So you can sort of understand why I would be here. It is the kind of department that's concerned with the questions of bringing technical design issues and engineering issues together with questions of human social issues. Often human-centered design is considered a kind of design method in which you inquire upon the user and develop technologies based on those kinds of inquiries, but the department sort of more broadly frames the question of what are the social consequences of technology, and how is it done, sometimes the socio-political context, sometimes the economic context of technology, like big tech questions as well. All of that occurs in this department that includes people like me who are sociologists, but also computer scientists. Also, we have like an English professor. It's a very heterogeneous department that sort of pulls together different threads, whatever is needed to answer the question of what is the human within a technological milieu. My own training is in sociology, and I'm very closely associated with a field called Science and Technology Studies, STS sometimes. STS is a field that is concerned with the sort of social, philosophical, and historical elements of the sciences, which is the kind of work that I do. Right now I'm on sabbatical. The reason why I was sort of like willing to jump over for this workshop, you really need to thank Chaitan because he like came far for this workshop. I hopped over from Oslo, where I'm on sabbatical and I'm in the informatics department there. It's lovely. Everyone should be on sabbatical all the time. It's really great. My personal research focus is on long-term research infrastructures. So I look at the ways in which we build organizational systems that support the doing of science over long periods of time, decades, even sort of thinking about centuries to the extent that that exists as well. And so part of my concern is technological in the IT sense, but also organizational as well. How do we support the doing of science over long periods of time is more than a tech question. It's also an organizational question, a question of collaboration, a question of funding, and a question of institutions. I kind of try to bring all of that together. And then just right now, I'm working on a book. Right now during the sabbatical, I'm writing a book about a series of AIDS research infrastructures that have come together over the last 35 years, sort of interoperated with each other and been sharing data more and more. And I'm sort of tracking that out into a historical book that tells the story simultaneously of the science of AIDS and also the research infrastructures that have supported AIDS research over the last 30 years. Which is where I'm going to draw this one story from you. It's a story from the field sites that I've been working on. The thing at the center of this, the research infrastructure at the center of this, is called the Multi-Center AIDS Cohort Study. It's as you can see, 1983 to the present. It's been running for nearly 40 years now, which is essentially, if you add a couple of years, 42 years is the history of AIDS altogether. 1981 is when we first medically recognized it. And so it's an infrastructure in the sense that it's been there for a long time and it's been supporting research on AIDS for the last almost 40 years. It's a research infrastructure in the sense that they follow cohorts of participants, people who are HIV positive and negative, and then collect data from them on a yearly basis now for many, many decades. And so in a sense, it's kind of like big data from the 1980s. We might not call it big data now, but for them, it was really big data. And then they do things over time. Since they're still running today, they are still doing kinds of new versions of computational stuff. It's an infrastructure in the sense that it supported science in the 80s, and it supports science now. And my question is, how do you build something that can sort of support the doing of science back when like everything was done on, not even PCs, right? Like they started by using tapes. All their data was like stored and shared on tapes, and then they like transferred them over to like disks, and then they transferred them over to other disks, and then more disks, and then hard drives and CDs, and then the web, and so on, right? So it's an organization that sort of existed across the history of the internet, and it's always been supporting cutting-edge research on AIDS. And my question there is, how do they do that? How do they sustain that over long periods of time? Sometimes when I say all that I just said to you now, people automatically start thinking about like, especially if I'm hanging out with a lot of computer science type folk, they immediately start thinking that I'm talking about like server rooms, everything's like really glossy and clean. And so often I show them this picture, which is a picture I took just a year and a half ago of their data management center. This is the data management center for the multi-center AIDS cohort study. I want you to, I always show this picture to try to give like a little sense of like, what does this actually look like in practice? What I don't want you thinking about immediately are like tidy rows of data that go back for 40 years. They have those, that exists. There are tidy rows of data, very large amounts of data that are very often of interest to computer science type folk. But that's not really what I want you to think about first. I want you to think about this as like sort of like the practical life of sustaining a long-term organization that collects data across decades and has to sort of transition across those decades. That was good. The music was good for it added some spark to the multi-center AIDS cohort study. Check out the picture where you're seeing disks, right? And you're seeing like mini disks over here. These are mini disks, which is what they were storing data in like the late 1990s. And then you'll see the disks over there. You'll see the papers stacked and all these like things to organize paper, and also stamps. The stamps are for organizing the paper. But then you see like the papers overflowing, which is what the real life of paper is. If you remember, it's always overflowing. But the CDs are data CDs, but they're overflowing as well, right? Like there's places to put them, but they're not all the places where they're supposed to be. And then all of those binders that you see in the back, all of those binders are their email correspondence starting in 1983, which they were already on email. And what they would do in 1980s is print out their emails and then put them into binders. That's how you stored emails. You didn't like put them in a disk or anything like that, not quite yet. And if you sort of keep looking, this is more sort of the chaos, it only like runs up to 2008. Those emails go up to 2008, which is when they decided that we don't need to print them anymore. That is the point in time where they were like, oh, now we can, like, let's just store them instead. And what they immediately started doing right after I took this picture was started scanning all those emails back into a digital form, which is what you do, right? Like, so first like emails were already digital, but then they printed them out, and then they had to scan them again and do like indexing and all these kind of like nice modern things to make it searchable, because that is how you store things. That's how I want you to think about a kind of long-term research organization. It's this constant process of like being digitally modernized. The first like email was really hot in 1983. I had these great data points where they're like, email or like electronic mail is now available. Let's not send HIV data. We don't know where this data is going to go. Already worried in the 1980s about security issues. They print this stuff out. They like store it for long periods of time. Why do they store it? Because they need some kind of knowledge of their own historical deliberations about scientific decisions. They might have to look back on these emails at one point in time, but then later they have to like digitize them again, which is exactly what they do with their data, right? Like the data is initially on tape and then on CD, and then they have to keep scanning it over and over again to get it into the present. So this is the kind of thing that I want you to think about when I use the word social in my research. This is kind of what I tend to mean. Historically layered over time, a kind of like media archaeology that you have to go through. This is one of the quotes from one of the information managers. I want you to keep it in mind. It contains a lot of wisdom. We are not the 2015 Cadillac of data management. This is from 2015, this interview that I did with her. We are more like the 1996 Subaru, but we get where we need to go. The point of the multi-center AIDS cohort study is not to be at the cutting edge of technology. It is not to be at like this very edge of wherever we are that day, semantic media, knowledge representation, machine learning. Those are all for them means to an end to investigate the question of HIV/AIDS. That is what they really care about. That's what they're actually doing. And so all these technological things that you're seeing here and the technological things that we're discussing in this room, to them are just like ways that they're getting to the question of HIV/AIDS so that they can either, help people out or solve it altogether. Notice that HIV/AIDS is a 40-year-old problem, right? We have not solved it. There is no cure and there is no vaccine. It's sort of in a constant state of chronic illness, which is exactly the state of their data management system, right? It's always in this kind of constant condition of being like a bit of a mess and then updating it over and over again. This is not to say that they aren't at this contemporary edge, though. One of the interesting things that happens with this group is that because of their data storage, this like long views of data, it's a really interesting form of data for people who are computationally interested. It's longitudinal data that has been systematically standardized and collected over years and decades across many cities. There's a lot of it, and it's interesting data in the sense at a conceptual level. It's like, aside from being sort of HIV/AIDS data, it's interesting that it's longitudinal data that presents distinct kinds of problems for statistical analysts. And so they actually regularly get people sort of the brand of people who come from AKBC and other kinds of like high-tech ventures which see them as a kind of place to do new kinds of analysis. This is just like one little shot that I took from a conference that occurred a couple of weeks ago. I still do field work with them. And as you can see, like, there's people coming in who are from, they call them data scientists. The AIDS scientists will be like the data scientists, but they generically refer to all people as data scientists now, even if they have specializations. And so this group was coming in and saying, well, now we're going to machine learn your medical names that you've been collecting over the last 30 years. You've been using different words for the different kinds of medicine, and we're just gonna we're gonna put this all into like an NLP system, and it's gonna sort out the issue for you. And then now you can do medication notes automatically processed instead of manually, as they used to do, right? Like they're a constant object of attention for technologically minded people because they have these really interesting long-term storage data issues that are sort of things that are good material, almost like playgrounds for technological people to work on. But here's one of the leading AIDS scientists and how she responds to this. This is what she says to me. Working with data scientists has been very difficult. They're often very cavalier in how they handle working across our data. It takes lots of back and forthing to work with them to get them to understand the technicalities of the data. Don't even get me started about specimen handling. They don't just collect data, they also collect blood and lots of other tissues that they store away. So she's saying, like, don't even try to get me to talk with like the data people about specimens, they don't understand them. Or really, what is the nature of our science? Biostatisticians are a little easier to work with, but still, the biostatisticians are easier to work with because they know something about biology. They're also trained up in biology and questions of information. But sometimes when you're working with data scientists who work across many domains, geo this week, bio this week, and so on, that can be very challenging because those people don't really understand the technicalities of the questions of AIDS. And so working with them can be particularly challenging. So this story sort of like contains lots and lots of things. I'm gonna wrap up now and make some more general points. But what I've just presented to you is the part of the research that I really do around questions of sociality and technology and high-techness. In particular, sort of I'm showing you the way in which knowledge can be considered to be deeply social itself, right? And the kind of social that I meant here is that it's, you know, it's not like stored in these like tidy little databases that someone goes and like extracts knowledge from. Rather, it's like in these like archives upon archives, decades upon decades of knowledge that is just like sometimes like the only person who knows the way that that room is organized that I show you are those information managers who work in it. There's no like catalog. It's a bunch of people who've been like layering these piles for like years and years. That's what their knowledge is. It's like in them. And then the second one is sort of like how the question of like how to capture or represent knowledge, whether we do it in an automated fashion or sort of by the handcrafting methods of old, it's still a kind of relationship that is established between what we may call information technologists and the domain here being AIDS science and maybe the IT side being the knowledge representation or knowledge-based people. There's a kind of social relationship that is established there. When she says to us, it's hard for me to work with these data scientists because they come in and they're very cavalier with their data, she's saying there's a challenge in the social relationship between these two groups of people and that needs to be managed. And that they come regularly. It's almost like for the last 20 years, someone has been coming and selling a new kind of IT solution to their problems every couple of years. And sometimes they're really frustrated with these sort of like cutting edge people who don't really particularly care about their data questions. So anyways, what I just showed you are two versions of what we might consider the social. I'm just gonna wrap up though with giving you like a little bit of thought from Peter Denning. Peter Denning was, he's sort of like a leading light within computer science itself. He was the president of the Association of Computing Machinery for many years. He's kind of like a philosopher of computing, but he himself was a leading computer scientist in his younger days. This is from an article that he wrote in his later days called What is Computing, where he's getting really philosophical, right? He's asking the question, like, what is computing, right? That's the kind of thing, like, we'll get some messages from very senior Jeff Bowker in social sciences. You get to ask these questions in your seniority. Here's a quote from the article that he wrote, What is Computing? It is like the fundamental questions in other fields. For example, what is life in biology? Or what are the fundamental forces in physics? That will never be fully resolved. Engaging in the question is more valuable than finding a definitive answer. The question of what is computing, for some people it might seem very simple. For a deep computer scientist, it's actually quite challenging, and you constantly are discovering new things that computing is. And he's saying, this is the nature of the sciences, the nature of the core objects in the science. Whenever you get close to that science, such as like what is life in biology, or what are the fundamental forces, when you get really close to those questions, they're actually kind of like the point of the field. They're not the thing you have an answer to. They're the kind of thing that you're constantly probing at. And that's kind of what I want to do today for the conversations that we're having today around what is the social, right? So now I'm being the same kind of scholar and saying, the question of what is the social for a social scientist, such as myself, is the question at the center of the field. We don't have a definitive answer to this thing. It's something that we probe at again and again. The first thing that comes to mind as a sociologist when you say social often is the question of race, class, and gender. We are going to talk about that today. We have some speakers who specialize in those topics. But as you see, I took you in a different direction. I took you in the question of like the social in the direction of what is the relationship between the technological and the social, or what is the way in which the social is contained in questions of knowledge. There's probably going to be, so I'm trying to open it up for you. This is what we're doing in this workshop, asking the question. I'm not going to quite tell you what is the answer to what is the social when it comes to AKBC. It's a driving question in this workshop. What do we need to think about? What are the facets that we should be considering as we go forward? And that's what a lot of the conversations are going to be about today. So I've talked to you about how knowledge is deeply social, or how knowledge can be a kind of relationship sort of between knowledge representers and the representee. But also we're going to talk about things like privacy and security, or inclusion and diversity, ethics and values, and other things that are going to come up. The question of the social is kind of up for grabs. That's what we're doing here today. Okay, so with that in mind, do you want to do a presentation, or do you want to do like a round of intros?
I think this is the intros, but I would like to do a presentation.
Yeah. Why don't we, so this, having set it this way, and I'm hopefully, like the feeling that I'm hoping that you have now is that the social can be a lot of things. So hopefully whatever you're bringing to the table, it's okay, right, is the question. It doesn't have to be a certain kind of thing.